Good morning. I encourage you, if you will, to get your Bibles out and turn to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13, we'll begin our reading there in just a moment. It is good to see you all this morning. We have several that are visiting with us and want you to know that you're our honored guests and that you are welcome to worship here with us at Pleasant Grove each and every opportunity that you may have. Most of our visitors that are here with us are here often, and it's good to see you. I know that your families are glad to see you as well. As we know, it's the beginning of school starting back, and at least in the Manning household, during the summer, we give the boys a little bit of leeway. It's about going to bed a little bit later and getting up a little bit later. Not a lot, but some. And they're all of us are very different. I like to go to bed relatively early and get up early. Beckett likes to go to bed early and get up real early. He's usually up between 5 and 5:30 every morning. Sewell, he could sleep about 12 hours a day. Cooper doesn't need a whole lot of sleep. Lindsay, I think, could sleep about 24 hours a day if you'd let her. She still says she's trying to catch up from when we got married. So, but sleep has been on our minds and getting back on a schedule as of late. And we hear oftentimes, when we go to the doctor on the news about sleep and about making sure that we get enough sleep. And just a few quick reminders of why we need sleep. It promotes growth. When you're sleeping, it helps you grow, whether you're old or young, whether it's tissues or you're a child. That's when you do most of your growing is when you're asleep. It helps the heart. It supports weight management. Obviously, I need to be sleeping more. It helps combat germs and it keeps your immune system strong. It reduces the risk of injury when it's helping your body heal and rest. It increases your attention span. It boosts memory and learning. See some wives elbowing some husbands that maybe they need to sleep a little bit more as well. But it prevents a myriad of diseases as well. So sleep is vitally important in our lives. I think we all know the importance of it. There are times all in our lives to where we want to go to sleep. We desire to go to sleep. It's a need in our lives. And it's something that's of importance. Most of us sleep for hours every day at some point. But also there's a problem with too much sleep. And that's often something that we don't think about. It can cause heart disease, too much sleep. It can cause difficulty concentrating, irritability, memory problems, accidents, and this is all from too much sleep. Difficulty waking up, depression, and this is something that they talk to teachers about at the beginning of every year. If there's a student that's constantly sleeping in your class, try to find out what's going on. It could be depression. It could be that they're not sleeping well at home, something else going on in their lives. Fatigue, anorexia, mood swings, sleep disorders. All this can come from having too much sleep. There are those that are just plain lazy, that don't want to get up and move. But have you ever thought about what the Bible has to say about sleep? If you start thinking, the Bible actually mentions sleep a lot in a lot of different ways. But we're going to talk about this morning, don't get caught sleeping. And we're going to take Matthew chapter 13. We're going to look at the parable of the tares in just a few moments and make some application from that. We have on the overhead there Matthew chapter 13 in verse 25, coming from that parable. It says, "But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and he sowed weeds among the wheat and went away." Now this is a parable that we don't necessarily study maybe as much as some of the others. We don't hear as much about it as some of the others. But it is full of sermons. Not just one, but many sermons. Depending on if you're reading from a newer version or one of the older versions, it may say that tares were sold instead of weeds. And I really like the rendering of the older versions there, using the word tares. When we think of weeds, we think of just, something growing up in our yard or in our garden. But a tare is something that is more specific. A tare resembles wheat. And it's oftentimes difficult to tell it apart from wheat until the bud comes out on there. If you may even have a marginal reading in your Bible that calls it a darnel or a bearded darnel. And those seeds are very strong and sporific and actually can be poisonous as well. It's something like ryegrass. It grows plentifully in Syria and Palestine. But if you're thinking of this is weeds sown into wheat, in my mind, I think of just green grass growing up into the wheat. But a tare resembles wheat. And until it grows up and matures, and this is actually a bearded darnel, is the plant that is talking about here, until that beard appears, it looks a lot like wheat. And so that to me is the reason I like the older translations using that term tare or tares there. But we don't need to get caught sleeping. I want us to look at the parable there in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, to get us a little bit better context of what we're going to talk about this morning. Beginning in verse 24 of Matthew chapter 13, it says, "He put another parable before them, saying, The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, Gather the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Now there's a lot in this parable here. But we're going to specifically think about sleeping today. And this all came about by while the men were sleeping, an enemy came in and sowed weeds among them and went away. While they were sleeping, they didn't know that this had happened until the grain started to grow. We're going to look this morning at several Bible characters that were caught sleeping. And we're going to take that and hopefully make some application to our lives and to get us to think that we don't need to get caught sleeping. The first one we're going to look at is one that we learned from a young age, is Jonah. We all know the story of Jonah. Instead of obeying God's command to go and preach to the people of Nineveh, he gets on a ship and tries to take off and hide from the Lord and go to Tarshish. We know that didn't fare very well for him. We know that God caused a great wind and tempest. And it occurred on the boat that he was on, but Jonah stayed fast asleep, as we'll see in just a moment. I think it's important for us to know what a tempest is. A tempest is a very violent and windy storm, especially one with very heavy rain, possible hail, or snow. In Jonah chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it says, "Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'Why do you mean, you sleeper?' Or what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise and call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give you a thought to us, that we may not perish." I want you to think about something for a moment. Jonah has all this going on around him. You would think he would have heard them throwing the cargo off of the boat in a violent wind and tempest on the sea. You would think that he would have felt the boat rocking and hearing the storms, the wind, the rain. But yet he was fast asleep. Do you think that Jonah went down into the ship to sleep to maybe further try to escape from his problems of running away from the Lord? Oftentimes people will go to sleep to get away from their problems. Yet he was able to sleep through all of this. Have you ever been in a violent storm? Probably all of us have at some point or another, maybe even a tornado. I can think of a couple times in my life that I've been in some rough storms. I can think of being in a tent one time where there were tornadoes just on the other side of the field. And I can remember the tent just puffing in and out. I can remember being in a travel trailer one time, and the wind blew so much that it picked the front of the trailer up and moved it over about 3 or 4 feet. I remember coming out of the trailer into the storm. But it's not fun. And I'm not sure how I could sleep through that, but Jonah did. Let's look at some thoughts about this. There are many that are asleep today who have no idea how perilous their situation is. I'm not saying physically asleep here, but I'm talking about being spiritually asleep. That they have all these things going on around them. Maybe they're trying to run and hide from what the truth may be. But they're in a perilous situation. Just as Jonah was in a perilous situation, they were afraid that they were going to die. They were throwing cargo over. They were asking him to pray to his God. They were praying to their gods. Are you one of these people that have those storms all around you? Some of them self-inflicted and created. We've seen it. People's lives who are a mess, oftentimes running from the Lord. Romans chapter 13, verses 11 through 14. It says, "Beside this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone. The day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. How are we doing? You know, as we see here, as my dad told us as we were growing up, he said nothing good happens after about 11 o'clock at night. He was captain of the fire station just right down here in Inslee for about 10 years or so. He could back that up with a lot of stories. And they stayed up all night, most nights, because of the things that were going on at night. So we need to make sure that we are spiritually awake, that we are paying attention to what is going on around us. What about the disciples of Jesus? This is something that we have been talking about a little bit and getting into our study and in the last days of Jesus and the life of Christ. But in Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42, this is a passage that's probably very familiar to us right now. But beginning in verse 32 of Mark chapter 14, it says, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.' And go a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, what you will.' And he came and found them sleeping. Father, in all things possible for you, remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that may not enter into temptation, that the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came out and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came a third time and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour is come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" I can't help but think, if I was in this situation here, knowing that Christ had said the end is near, Christ would have been their best of friends. Not only did they know that he was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, but one of their closest friends. Yet they fell asleep on him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. It says that he was grieved to the point of death. Are we asleep on Jesus today? Do we sleep on Jesus today? I dare say that there are some Christians that do. See, at a time when Jesus was dealing with great distress, and he needed his disciples, his friends, the most, they didn't comfort him. They fell asleep on him. Today, there are spiritually worn people who are asleep. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. I can only imagine the distress that Jesus had here. It tells us, and we'll talk about it more in the next few Bible classes. And I don't want to get into that too much. But he was grieved here, it tells us, to the point of death. He fell to the ground. Some of the other parallel passages said he threw himself on the ground. He knew his betrayal was at hand. He knew that the crucifixion was coming. Yet his disciples fell asleep on him. You can't be watchful if you're asleep. If you knew that there was a lion that was about to come around and devour you, a physical, if there was a lion in the neighborhood, what would you do? You'd prepare for it, wouldn't you? You would go in your house, you would lock the doors, you would bring your animals inside. You'd be looking out for it. Brothers and sisters, there's a lion that is roaming around much worse than any king of the jungle on this earth that we could ever see. That's the devil. And he's looking for somebody to devour. And if we're asleep, we're not going to see it coming. I think of one of my aunts. She lives out in Montana. We were texting one day, and she said that she'd had to bring her dogs in. That in their little neighborhood Facebook group, there was a mountain lion watch. They were having to watch out for the mountain lion. We need to be ever watchful. And for us to be watchful, we need to be awake. I also want you to just put in the back of your mind that term there, sober-minded, or being sober. We're going to see that term again a few times as we go through the rest of our study this morning. What about Samson? Here's another story that we learn about as children. 3 times, Delilah tried to discover the source of Samson's strength. And what did he do? In Judges chapter 16, it said, Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Skipping down to verse 11, and he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and not like any other man. And we know that in each one of these occasions here, he was asleep, and they tried to do this to him. They waited till he was asleep. In Judges chapter 16 and verse 13, then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with a web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak like any other man. You see, they attacked Samson while he was sleeping. They tried to do these things while he was sleeping, because they knew of his great strength. There was no way that they could defeat him if he was awake. We see there in Judges chapter 16, verses 16 through 22, after a lot of effort, Samson finally told Delilah the source of his strength, and he slept with false security. You know, you always hear the adage of fool me once, shame on me. Or fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Samson, to be as strong as he was blinded. He was asleep, and we'll look at that in just a second.
If you look there in Judges chapter 16, beginning in verse 16 and reading through verse 22, it says, "And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day, and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart, and he said to her, A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money into her hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow after it had been shaved. Do we see what happens here to Samson when he goes to sleep? He's not paying attention. He's not watchful. Today there are some that are asleep due to the affection of someone or something. Have you ever heard the adage that love is blind? I can think of several Christians who have left the faith because of a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse. We need to be very careful, especially our young people. It's always easier to pull someone down than it is to pull someone up. I've seen people that wanted something so bad, whether it was some physical item or person, that they lost their focus on what was really important and fell into the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We see that happen here with Samson. What about the slothful? In Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 through 34, it says, "I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw it and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, and a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." Those wise proverbs. So many are lazy and need to wake up and do the will of God. I see more and more lazy people every day. People that don't want to work, that don't want to get their hands dirty, that don't want to sweat. But I'm also sad to say that I see people who are lazy Christians, that don't want to study, that don't want to work, that don't want to stand up for what is right. Those who are asleep in the Lord. How are we doing today? We must make sure that we're not sleeping on the job. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 14 through 17. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Wake up. It says here, look carefully how you walk. In order to look, you've got to be awake. We cannot be spiritually sleeping ever. We've got to be awake. We've got to be looking around. We've got to be growing. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 6 and 8. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. There's that word again. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. If you turn to that passage there, very familiar verse to us, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 2. The day of the Lord will come what? Like a thief in the night. What do people do at night? They sleep. We can't be asleep as Christians. We can't be spiritually asleep. We need to make sure that we're awake, that we're constantly looking. We're looking out for sin. We're looking for ways to grow as a Christian. We cannot sleep on the job. We cannot get caught sleeping. How are we doing? How are we doing? Christians are to be alert and on guard. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action, being sober-minded. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Action. You got to be awake to be active. That term sober-minded again. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Again in 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 and 9. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Resist him. Firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. How are we doing? Are we being watchful, awake? Are we being sober-minded? Are we resisting? In order to resist, you've got to be awake. How are we doing? Are we sleeping as Christians? Or are we awake? We cannot afford to get caught sleeping. A few final thoughts this morning. We as Christians cannot go to sleep on matters of importance. We can't. We've got to stand up. We've got to be firm. We've got to be watchful. We've got to be sober-minded. But also, the church cannot go to sleep on matters of importance as well. We can't let things slide that are contrary to God's will. We need to stand up. We need to fight. As we sang just before the sermon, soldiers of Christ, arise. Get up. Put your armor on. And be a Christian. We need to be working right now. And later, we can have our rest. Eternal rest in heaven. Leave you with this passage this morning, Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. We must be awake to do the Lord's will. We can't get caught sleeping. The sermon is yours. Hope that it's been one of encouragement to remember who you are, a child of God, and who you represent each and every day, so that you don't get caught sleeping. We got to wake up. We got to do what is right so that we can have that home in heaven. If you are here this morning and you've been asleep, now's the time to wake up. And if you're not a Christian, now's the time to become one. To be immersed in water, to wash away your sins, and to awake as a child of God. If we can help you in any way this morning, come as we stand.